Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to New Books in Archaeology, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Sarah Newman, one of the hosts of the channel, and today I'm talking to William Taylor about his new book, Hoofbeats: How Horses Shaped Human History. Welcome to the podcast, Will.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
It's great to have you. I want to start off by asking you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe a little bit of the background that led you to write this book.
Yeah, I am by training an archaeozoologist, which means that, I'm uh, somebody who spends my time looking at animal bones. And, um, you know, uh, basically from the moment I got interested in archaeology, I've been interested in animals and human-animal relationships. And in particular, one of the questions that drew me into this discipline is horses and the domestication of horses, people's relationship with horses. And, the reason for this is being an attractive topic or an interesting topic to me, especially back when I was a young lad and no longer can claim that, but was the my kind of family history and connection. So for me, I grew up in Montana, but in a kind of a funny situation, which is that my grandpa was like a classic Montana cowboy rancher guy. My dad kind of grew up in that world and became a lawyer. And in the meantime, like my grandpa back in the 20s was riding around on horses, and meanwhile, I grew up in a pretty kind of suburban, world in which, the neighbors had horses down the street, but it's not like I really ended up spending a lot of time around the animals growing up. But at the same time, like, actually, I think I might even be able to pull it over into the video screen here. Is this on video or is it only audio?
It's only audio,
Oh,
but
okay. So imagine a horrific bronze horse lamp, which I now have on my desk here, but it just kind of illustrative of the material culture in the house that I grew up in was like very much like horse culture, tacky cowboy paintings and harness shaped mirrors and horse brasses on everything. So I kind of grew up, we dress in cowboy boots and hats on a special occasion, but so there's this big like contradiction in my life in that like it was part of horse culture, but didn't really understand horses. And so when I got interested in archaeology as a student, my first experience actually doing this stuff in a meaningful sense was in Mongolia. And I got kind of involved. I got brought along as an assistant on a project that was looking at really ancient horse culture in the Mongolian steppes, the Altai Mountains. And one of the first things I had a chance to do was help excavate a, 2,500-year-old burial of a horse. And it was a pretty extraordinary experience for me in that it not only was, oh, I liked animals and it's cool being in Mongolia, but it was this moment of connection to the deeper aspects of the human horse story. And at the same time, I kind of, in the process, learned all the kinship and similarities and connections I shared with, contemporary Mongolia and made friends and social connections really easily. And I felt like in the process, maybe I was starting to understand some of the deeper, threads of my own kind of family's, story a little bit. And so that really motivated me to explore this topic of archaeozoology and what it tells us about people and horses in the past. And so, doing that over the years, I developed an appreciation for just how fast the science world was changing that story. And like everybody else, I read like, David Anthony's Horse, the Wheel, and Language and was really interested in some of the science that came out. But most of the story there, I started to realize, was was a decade or 2 decades out of date. And with the advent of, new advances in things like biomolecular sciences and, DNA and some of these tools really shaking up the picture, but it hadn't quite been retold, especially not from a more scientifically grounded lens. This is a topic that gets talked about a lot in pop sci and history and, even folks, from the, modern kind of sociology or human animal relationships, but not from like a deep time in archaeological science lens. So that was kind of the motivation for writing the book. I had been wanting to write this for a while, but was never dumb enough to start doing that until the pandemic hit. And then I thought, all right, I guess now is the time. And, you know, uh, didn't realize, that this process would take, 4 years of kind of nose to the grindstone working every weekend here. But I think that, that was the motivation behind the book.
Great. I mean, I think it's interesting to hear about your own background and kind of the wide range of influences because I think that that is really reflected in the really broad scope of the book.
Yeah.
So maybe we can talk about that for a minute. And I mean, I think one of the things that I felt reading the book was that it's really, I mean, it's we're talking about all of horse history all around the globe. So could you tell us a little bit about how you went about doing that kind of research to sort of cover that
Yeah.
kind of scope?
So I think the scope is sort of also reflects kind of my own journey through the topic, which is that, somewhat counterintuitively, I started exploring this topic on the other side of the world, right? And started, my dissertation work, a lot of my initial scholarship was in the steppes of Mongolia. And in the process, right, we had to develop familiarity, workflows, collaborations that are working with outside the realm of, historical documents or really squeezing, information out of almost nothing else other than horse remains themselves. And in the process, kind of honed, a very flexible and powerful toolkit. And one of the things that, emerged from doing this mostly through coffee table conversations is like, well, what does this approach tell us about, horses in the Great Plains, for example, or, it'd go down to a conference in Argentina and people would have these conversations like, wow, why aren't we talking about this here? And so, I think over time, the you know s- archaeology especially the archaeozoology is a very small, numerically small group of people, and it's very, very global. Folks that are interested in this, you go to a conference and you're going to see somebody from every corner of the world. And so I ended up spending a lot of time with folks that came from a corner of the world that were impacted in some important way by horses, and some of those relationships turned into collaborations, right? So I had a position after grad school. I was working in Germany, and at that time, we started projects that were looking at horse culture in North America, in South America, in Central Asia, China, and some of these different threads. And so um, I think the global nature of the book really kind of emerges from the fact that there is a global community of scientists that are all deeply connected to that human horse story. And some of that is, out of my scholarship, but a lot of it is just an awareness of the other science that has taken place. Everyone is kind of taking some of these tools and applying them to questions in their own backyard, because the scope of the impact of horses is truly global, in a really, I think, unique way.
It's great how the book kind of reflects the process behind it as well. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
I think
Maybe
inevitable.
let's kind of turn a little bit more to the actual kind of, a little bit chapter by chapter of the
Sure.
book, but maybe you could say briefly, I mean, you use this technique of different beats to organize the
Right.
story. So maybe you could just kind of say briefly how you chose to do that, and then we'll use that to kind of structure the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a bit cheeky, that we've I don't know, looks like my thumbs down has been showing up on the screen there. Didn't mean for that to happen. Um, the structuring principle of the book is this idea of hoof beats, and it sort of cheekily has taken, four sort of key moments in the human horse story and given them, and I like the word beat because it reflects, I think, some important uh, distinctions. Each one of these events is in some ways sort of separate and powerful, but also deeply interrelated and connected, right? And so that was, the structuring metaphor of the hoof beats, if you will. A little silly, but I think reflects the speed, the power, and the interrelatedness of some of these major momentous shifts in the human horse story. And I think the first one that I've selected here is kind of that, the evolution of the horse and its relationship with people as a kind of hunter hunted situation. In many ways, this is the first beat and the one that took the longest to play out. So when we start exploring the human horse relationship, we're talking about like the asteroid collision that wiped out the dinosaurs first. And that's a very deep point in time to start. Archaeologists probably not usually starting at like, the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event. But with horses, it's actually kind of important because, this is the landscape in which, the shifting kind of ecological niches of the last 50, 60 million years um, kind of brought the primate and ancient horse story. They started off kind of similar. They brought them apart in different ways in terms of especially horses adapting to the emergence of grasslands, which, as we know them now, big, almost kind of homogeneous, spacious, open plains type environments, you know, didn't exist per se in the time that, both primates and kind of what we call dawn horses, these tiny little three-toed, skittish creatures that probably not even really eating uh, a diet like we would recognize today. Um, uh, but the emergence of those grasslands really shaped horses into the animals that we would recognize today. So they developed, um, specialized dentition and digestive systems for eating really crappy grass, right? That kind of necessitated moving around a lot, right? They developed, obviously, tremendous size and speed, right? These are related to the demands of surviving predation in the open grasslands. And one of the things that I especially thought it was important to point out is, their social dynamics of horses are in many ways the most important piece of their relationship with people. They're not just a herd animal in the sense that, developing that cooperative social behavior kind of allowed them to, there's nowhere to hide in the grasslands, right? And at times over the last, millions of years, there's been some pretty ferocious predators that kind of take advantage of that. And so horses developed excellent communication skills, very complex social relationships, right? They're great listeners. They keep an eye on a lot of things. Um, and also uh, relationships with each other that eventually would impact how humans were able to kind of step in and manage their, something we would know as like a herd, right? In terms of like, controlling reproductive behavior or having a lead stallion or these kinds of things. So it is, that initial relationship is deeply rooted in the biology, but it's also rooted in a very, very ancient connection with early hominins. And one of the things that I pointed out in the book is that horses might be the first animal we have really solid evidence for like direct predation uh, by humans, by human ancestors. And we get this in some pretty striking kind of smoking gun type situations. There is one very famous site in Germany known as Schöningen, in which there's wooden spears preserved along with the horses that were hunted on the lake shore. But other early sites show that folks were using horse remains, horse bones, for example, as expedient tools at a very, very ancient time. And as we move into time periods we would recognize more as like early modern humans, horses are just almost an obsession of ancient human artists in Eurasia, for example. They're really the most commonly depicted animal in, European cave art. They're showing up in carvings. Um, and so they're alongside this prey relationship. They were clearly deeply important in worldview, in artwork, in culture, and I just thought it was important to highlight just how interdigitated horses were to ancient human lifeways. Um, Pretty much anywhere that horses existed, and that extends even to the earliest, indigenous folks in North America and South America too. So horses and their relatives, kind of a key part of lifeways wherever they lived, um, up until the landscapes and the environments of the Holocene started to shift and those relationships changed in other ways. So that's the first beat of the book is really just taking us through almost the whole trajectory of human history and showing how deep those connections run with horses.
Yeah, thanks. And I think one thing that's, I mean, impressive about the scale of the narrative that you have in the book is also that it highlights kind of the variety of evidence that you have to use to tell this story. I mean, yeah, as you said, there's some points that you start with that are really kind of beyond the general scope of archaeology, and so there's kind of different evidence for how to tell the story that far back in the past.
Yeah, and
Um,
I one of the frustrating parts about being an archaeologist is that the further back you go in time, like the more limited the kind of information that we still get to work with, right? So we have this idea of, cavemen smashing things with rocks, but that's partly because all that really preserves once you go back a certain amount of time are like fossilized things or actual stone and some of these things. And so the degree to which we can explore the richness of that human horse relationship changes. And I think people have often been left with the implication that it is somehow primitive, right? But even in things like bone and stone, you can see aspects of the relationship that go beyond just predation, right? You can see using using horses to produce tools. Some are expedient, some are very much, not expedient, but like deeply curated and carefully prepared. And then artwork, right? I mean, these are things that are pretty hard to argue with as, uh, you know, in terms of like primitive or limited, and they show that relationship probably very, very deep and complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's turn now to the second beat where you have kind of a different array of, in some ways, richer evidence to talk about kind of the domestication of horses. And this one you term the cart, right? The
Yeah,
second beat.
so the second beat here um, seeks to, understand the origins of the domestication relationship. And it does so in a couple different ways. One is, sort of exploring some of the different ideas that have been out there about when and why and how horses were domesticated. And there is a little bit of balloon popping that I do there just based on trying to take, the fresh set of empirical evidence, emerging scholarship, which is, in general, folks have been oriented to roughly the right time and the right place for a very long time, right? It's clear at a certain point horses are everywhere in the archaeological record and there's historic documents, and we kind of understand them as a steppe animal, right? So although there have been various hypotheses, everyone around the world has kind of at one point thought, hey, maybe we also domesticated the horse ourselves. But in general, science has been focused on this time period of kind of the Western Eurasian steppes for a very long time. But the question is kind of how do we trace domestication? How did it start? And what constitutes evidence of this changing relationship? There are a lot of uh, questions about what is domestication. Is it with horses? Does that mean when people started riding them? Does it mean other things like meat and milk? And so there's a lot of these. Does it mean control over reproduction? There's all kinds of things that go into the question. And I think one of the things that I think was really emerged in doing the research for hoofbeats is horse domestication now actually has to be understood as part of uh, a broader trajectory of kind of shifting multi-species relationships and a whole host of changing interactions between people and plants and animals in Western Asia across the Holocene. So when we start thinking about horse domestication, I actually start talking us through some of the basics around other large animal domestication, and how it related to, you know, um, things like domestication of certain Western Asian grains. And one of the things that is kind of striking to recognize is that the origins of horse transport probably begin with developments in cattle transport, the domestication of the donkey, and kind of a very interesting kind of technological and cultural system based in largely in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Western Asia outside of the steppes, in which, beginning in the kind of end of the fourth millennium BC, we have very clear and strong and beautiful documentation of these emerging animal transport systems. Um, so I kind of take us through what this even me when I started to look into this was sort of dumbfounded by what some of the new science is saying around human equid relationships that were outside of the horse. And in particular, this incredible science that has now shown that what people were kind of arguing about in the historic record of Mesopotamia were people hybridizing or breeding donkeys with other equids. Um, Actually shows up in things like the genomics of some of the animals that have been recovered from archaeological sites. And these animals that sometimes called a kunga, for example, they're a first generation hybrid between a donkey and the Asian wild ass, or what you might call a hemion. These are animals or an onager. We know these animals, they live across Asia today as a wild animal, but they were part of the shifting set of experimentation, folks trying to bring in other animals into to do things like pull carts or even these, funny little Fred Flintstone type, uh, you know, proto chariot type things. And there were centuries of these kind of relationships taking place at the edges of Central Asia. And that is important context to understanding, when and how and why horses made their way into uh, human societies in the steppes. So that second beat here really tries to zoom out a little bit when we think and talk about horse domestication. I think a lot of us have been envisioning, a kind of mythological group of steppe folks, uh, you know, romantically, you know, interacting with horses and maybe deciding maybe now's the day that we're gonna, rope and ride one or and I think we need to understand that that domestication process was part of this whole incredible set of social changes that are almost continental in scale, beginning with the domestication of plants and other animals in Western Asia, 11, 12,000 years ago.
I think one of the things that's really great about that beat and the chapters in it is kind of going along with what you've been saying, that there's this really entangled world of technology and different animals and different plants and these it's not really like, people are thinking, let me domesticate this animal in order to pull this cart. It's sort of like those things kind of work in tandem, that developments in, I mean, the wheel and the cart and domesticating cattle and all sorts of things are kind of feeding into each other in a way that's much more complicated than sometimes the narratives that we hear in school.
Yeah, and with horses in particular, I think we're starting to see that the domestication of the horse took place in the context of folks that already, knew their way around herding animals. They were already interested in and occupying, grassland environments in a pretty mobile way, but interested in, and they already knew horses in other ways, right? They had continued, to have wild horses be a part of their repertoire of animals that, uh, they engaged with for subsistence purposes. So they knew a lot about their environments. They knew a lot about animal transport, and there's still much, much to learn about how, when, and why, and how that early domestication happened. In part because now that we have all of these tools at our disposal, the places where science is pointing us towards are places like the Ukrainian war zone, or Western Russia, areas that a lot of the relevant archaeological record is kind of logistically hard to connect with because of the contemporary social reality of science. And so, figuring out in detail the motivation and the mechanics of these processes is going to take us years, and it's going to require navigating some of those situations too. But I think what we are learning now is that perhaps horse domestication took place a little later than we thought, but by folks that had a lot of context, a lot of existing, as you say, very complex interactions in terms of their pastoral relationships, wild relationships, technology, culture, and each one of those facets probably impacted the process in a certain way. But what that shows us, I think, with the new kind of understanding of horses probably entering into a more sustained level of control by people really towards the end of the third millennium BC, maybe not super far off from 2000 BC, is that when that transition took place, it wasn't like a gradual or a sort of a slow building process, but really something more akin to a lightning strike, something incredibly transformative where within a few hundred years, the ripples were felt in almost every corner of the continent, right? So I think that, this beat uh, closes here by exploring the ways that horse domestication really shook up the societies of the ancient world. And my argument is sort of that this process was twofold. One is in the grassland zones of Eurasia, horses were very transformative as a herd animal. So folks could move around more, right? They could move farther, they could move faster, they could move more easily in terms of both migrations as well as just the day-to-day, moving a herd of livestock across a dry or, desert-like grassland landscape. Um, and so horses kind of developed, spread through um, the the temperate and grassland zones of Eurasia through a process of, hey, that would be it's clear that this is a animal is interesting addition to our lifeways and kind of catalyzing things like folks raising horses for meat or this tradition, which is still very, prevalent and important today of horse milk and dairy based pastoralism, um, in a more gentle spread in which they had an important impact on, ecology and economy for folks. But at the same time, there is a much more pernicious element to the horse's initial spread for folks that lived far away from horse country. And I think it would highlight some of the examples, and again, some of these are hard to trace with great detail because they're kind of before detailed historic records, but looks like access to horses, empowered a lot of folks to do things like conquest in places ranging from, ancient Greece and ancient Egypt to the Indus Valley or the area I know best, East Asia. So the Shang Dynasty of China. Within a few hundred years, these major, agricultural civilizations were shaken up pretty badly through the actions of, essentially out outsider folks who had access to horses. And initially, this is some of these have been on the radar of historians and archaeologists and like for a very long time, but they've often been phrased as Indo-European, right? As though there was some sort of grand association of this process with a particular linguistic and ethnic group. And while it is true that probably some of the folks that had earliest access to domestic horses did speak Indo-European languages, there are other cases where they clearly did not, right? And I think it was more about horses than about people. And that's what I try to highlight there in the book.
Interesting. So let's turn to the third beat then, the rider, and maybe you could also just start by saying a little bit about kind of that separation, that there's kind of one type of relationship that has to do with transport, and then this is, well, I guess riding is also transport, but yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about your choice to
Yeah,
separate
so
those two.
this was an interesting thing for us to think about. For folks that know horses today, probably the main way we know them is through getting on their back and riding around on them directly. But it's a pretty extraordinary thing to do to a large prey animal when you think about it. Probably one of the most significant predators of horses in their own evolutionary history have been humans. And here we are in a relationship and we're just kind of hopping on their back and gently guiding them around. And so one of the important inflection points here is this transition in how folks are able to uh, control horses. Now, it is probably true that from the very beginning, not just horses, but any equids, and even going back to pre-equid things like cattle, there were situations in which folks would and did get on the back of a horse. So I think people often think of the question of uh, riding and the origins of riding in a maybe overly simplified way. You could get on if you want. You could hop on the back of a moose or a zebra or any number of animals for a short period of time, right? But the question is, what can you effectively do especially in a high stakes setting, with control of an animal? And at the beginning, the archaeological record tells us that most of the time for almost 1,000 years, folks were using horses primarily in this sort of chariot transport situation. Now there'd be a team of animals, you're not on the animal's back, you're a little more distant, you have this kind of structure, and it's possible to control animals, even these wild hemions, with a pretty simple control system, right? So before there were ever horse chariots, you even had these, donkeys and wild ass being controlled, a team of four with just nothing but a simple little lip or nose ring, right? And folks will go into battles and be able to control this, somewhat chaotically, probably, team of animals even in a conflict situation in which, imagine the pandemonium of a, four donkey cart going into some sort of armed conflict. Um, and so when horses were first used for transport, there were innovations right away that allowed these kind of stronger and faster and more ornery animals to be controlled, right? We innovated the mouthpiece system of control, which does not appear anywhere until the first domestic horses and probably had some important role in communication, right? But those initial systems of technologically systems of control over horses were pretty rudimentary. Uh, they were, in many ways, just sort of a piece of rope through the mouth. Um, and so it is a few centuries before we really see a systematic role for mounted horse riding appearing in any of the documentation or archaeological record that we have. And when they do, for example, I for the book I went to some of these grand murals of ancient Egypt, like the one of Ramses the Great that I highlight in the book. If you poke along these murals, you can see these huge chariot battle scenes, and then one or two of these little naked guys riding on their horse, and they were probably tasked with certain things that didn't require a lot of hard stops or right left turns, but were like messengers or scouts or this sort of thing. And so uh, in this third beat here, we kind of follow the technology and transition towards how do we get to the kind of mounted riding that we know today? And some of that was, uh, the science is telling us there were breeding for horses that were a little more tractable, a little less aggressive, right? Some of that was technological, the innovation of more sophisticated mouthpieces, these kind of jointed metal mouthpieces that could do a little more nuanced control. Um, and some of it was probably cultural, right? Folks learning the behavior of the horse and the ways that they could interact and communicate better with the horse. I think one panel I show in the book is the first historical record of cavalry comes out of Assyria in the ninth century BC, and you've got these two fellas riding alongside each other, helping each other out. So one's holding the reins and the other one's shooting a bow, right? So it's a pretty interesting and complex process, but it eventually it gave us a world in which, even to a much greater degree, um, the dynamics of who had horses really shaped the ancient world. So in that beat, I explore the ways that the origins of horse riding and the innovation of other pieces of technology like the saddle and the stirrup, which even through some of our own work is now pointing towards places like Mongolia, as a potential origin point for these world shaping technologies. Each of these steps in the process really kind of empowering the grassland cultures of the ancient world and kind of elevating them to places of um, not just military, but like economic and cultural uh, prominence as kind of linking hubs of the ancient world. So this is a piece of the story that's maybe been missing from kind of especially Western scholarship. In a place like Mongolia, archaeology shows us things like Roman glass or this silver platter depicting Hercules, right? From the second century BC. We're talking about time periods in which polities and empires and trade networks and centers of gravity for the ancient world emerged in the steppes, 1,000 years before the Mongol Empire, but related to these emerging dynamics of having the most horses, having, this skill in horsemanship, and these, incredible level of control and connectivity across the ancient world, and that need for horses also shaping the folks that lived outside of the steppes in key ways. So I kind of walk through the emergence of the formalized networks around the Silk Road, right? And the way that China in particular was just totally boxed in by their need to have a functioning cavalry, right? To have a postal system and some of these things that needed horses, but found themselves in kind of a conflict situation with their steppe neighbors and had to forge trade routes that would link them with places like Central Asia. And I think this has been the thesis of a lot of scholarship lately to kind of explore the driving role of horses in building, uh, inter-Asian trade networks, transcontinental trade networks into the highlands of the Himalaya and even into South Asia with this aptly named kind of Tea Horse Road, right? So that rider chapter really tried to explore the ways that riding, emerged in many ways as a step innovation and at the very least, an innovation that really empowered the grassland, um, you know, areas and cultures of the world, placing them as centers that really connected the continent of Eurasia in particular for the first time, in a really powerful way.
Great. Well, maybe that's a good segue then to talk about kind of the next kind of the global network when in the last beat you kind of talk about the spread of horses uh, throughout the Pacific and in a way kind of back to the Americas.
Yeah, I think, this is in many ways, uh, the most ambitious, and there's a lot of different corners of the world that, get combined into this section, but it's the one that matters the most to me, right? As somebody who grew up, I didn't grow up in the Eurasian steppes, and here I am thinking of our own culture in, Colorado and Montana as a horse culture, kind of follow the ways that horses spread out of the steppes and into new environments. Now, some of these dispersals were pretty cool and pretty impressive, but took place a long time ago, right? Horses reaching the British Isles or Scandinavia or Japan, or even, Iceland and Greenland. These are um, spread dispersals that took place, you know, um, deeper in time before we had really this kind of open ocean voyaging that we recognize as having shaped the last 600 years of history. In particular, one of the important spreads there was actually across the Sahara Desert, with the kind of partnership with camels, for example, and the Islamic, world, expanding Islamic world, horses reaching the kind of Sahel region of the, southern margin of the Sahara, in which they gave rise to, really transformative kind of equestrian empires, if you will, in other areas of the world. But um, you know, perhaps the most transformative uh, final step in that human horse relationship is the ability um, for horses to transcend the limitations of the continental landmass, right? And these dispersals that kind of accompanied, European colonial ambitions in the Americas, South Africa, Australasia, the Pacific. Um, and one of the things that I think archaeology is telling us is that while this has often been thought of as an extension of the colonial narrative, an extension, guns, germs, and steel, the horses as part of the glory of European colonialism. I think what one of the things science is telling us is that as horses reach some of these environments, many of which, uh, were kind of ancestrally home to wild horses, for example, like North and South America, they really flourished, and they flourished in a way that often had very little to do with the direct actions or impact of European colonial folks. And so, in places like Argentina, the Great Plains of North America, you had this very rapid dispersal of horses um, through indigenous social networks, through their kind of rerouting as a species on the landscape as well, that really empowered kind of indigenous sovereignty and kind of anti-colonial, um, you know, military action. So the cavalry record of a place like, colonial Argentina or the U.S. cavalry, not particularly impressive. In fact, it's a story of pretty regular defeats at the hands of really sophisticated and powerful horse cultures for a very, very long time before kind of the turning tide of mechanization, other aspects of colonialism like genocide and some of these things eventually kind of spelled the end for that piece. And I kind of conclude the book by looking at the ways in which horses have kind of receded, even as they reach this sort of global distribution, even reaching at one point with one ill-fated expedition, even reaching the shores of Antarctica. Um, the emergence of kind of mechanized vehicles and automotives, combustion engines, these kind of things. That's really the final um, stage in the most recent parts of the human horse story. And it's sort of shocking how quickly the global footprint of horses has kind of been papered over by that mechanization. I say papered over because I think a lot of the legacy and impacts of a world that was so recently almost entirely built on horseback, from agriculture, communication, livelihood, military, these kind of things, um, has been sort of replaced with the mechanized alternatives. And for a while, it wasn't actually true that things like the railroad and industrial economies reduced the importance of horses. They actually increased them for a period of time as, we needed horses to pull heavier things, connect the dots between the emerging railroad. Folks will be familiar with things like the Pony Express, right? Which was this, very short-lived uh, uh, wildly ambitious horse-based relay that linked the edges of the railroad system in colonial America. And so all of these things, were extraordinarily pervasive, even in the colonial world until very, very recently. And I like to point out that so my own grandfather, not everyone has a grandfather that was born in 1903, but mine was. And so within the span of his life, in just two generations in my family, we went from a world that was all about horses to one in which, I'm driving a motor vehicle to work and I have to, book something online if I want to go ride a horse in my corner of the world. But there are many parts of the world in which that's not true. And for example, every summer in Mongolia, I don't go to Mongolia to ride horses. I go to Mongolia to do archaeological scholarship, but I often end up needing to spend 2 or 3 weeks on horseback to get to where we need to be, right? And so there are parts of the world that horses are still filling that day-to-day role in a pretty direct and meaningful way, not just for transport, but for things like meat and milk. And so I think the future of the human horse relationship is complicated. Um, and it's not going to look the same everywhere. But I do think in quote unquote horse country, and that can include a lot of places, including, where I'm sitting right now. I think there's a role for horses in the future that is not just restricted to things like, you know, uh, sports or police breaking up a protest or some of the things that we might see them restricted to in urban environments today. So, and in particular, a lot of my colleagues and partners in places like the Great Plains here, native folks, there's a lot of efforts to revitalize, you know, horses and horsemanship as, for their power in ceremony and, youth programs and some of these things too. And so it's going to be an interesting thing to see where, horses find their role in a rapidly shifting world in the years ahead.
Maybe just before we wrap up, I mean, you just mentioned some of your collaborators and partners in the Midwest, in the Plains, and in the final section of the book, I mean, you've been talking a little bit about the work that you do in Mongolia and specifically the archaeozoology work that you do, but maybe you could talk a little bit about your research in the Plains, which sounded like it was kind of another way of transforming the narrative of human horse histories.
Yeah, so when we started, working collaboratively with um, not just native archaeologists, but also sometimes, tribal historians, elders, folks that know uh, uh, and kind of steward the story of people and horses in this part of the world, we found that, the this in a place like the United States, the story of horses is like one in which, it falls under the purview of history in the sense that there are some written document by some European person that can take us back to the, 1500s or thereabouts. And so it often has been exempted from exploring through other um, approaches, including archaeology. And what we found through that kind of collaborative approach is that for a lot of folks, um, the story that emerged through kind of a scientific archaeology was actually lining up and validating a perspective that you might get from oral traditions or a tribal historian. For example, we found that the pretty solid archaeological evidence that horses spread to places like Wyoming or Idaho, pretty far north in the Rockies um, of the US, essentially within a few decades of their, becoming entrenched on the continent of North America. And in those areas, long before you would have had any, documented presence of European people. And so the mechanism through which they spread with this speed and at this antiquity, has to have been through indigenous networks of kind of connectivity and exchange and this sort of thing. And so in some cases that has been very powerful validation of things. For example, one of our partners, you know, is a Comanche scholar who pointed out that the ancestral Comanche, territory there is the same area where we're finding some of these very, very early evidence of horses, but they're not just, um, like a wild horse wandering north, but they're horses that are integrated already into ceremony, right? They're horses that are showing evidence of receiving veterinary care or being used in transport. And you know, lining up with encoded relationships stored even in the language itself that kind of indicates, that, for example, Comanche folks had a relationship with horses before they moved to the southern plains, right? Which might not seem like the most, the trajectory here might be 100 years or 150 years, not the most to an archaeologist, the biggest chronological difference, but extending that relationship in a way that it kind of invalidates some of these more biased perspectives that you're finding in the historical record, validating some of the understandings of sequence and relationship and timing that are found in oral traditions, and kind of establishing that for many of these folks, their relationship with horses is sort of organically their own, right? It's not necessarily a legacy of colonization in the way that it's been framed, even though, these horses, um, may have been dispersing ultimately from a point of European origin here. So I think and what's interesting is that story is actually echoing even in our findings, for example, from southern Patagonia, in which, the archaeological instances of horses are appearing long before you ever had a documentation of that in a European diary or journal or chronicle of that sort of thing. So I think there's much more to learn through those kind of collaborative approaches, and speaks to the rapidity and importance of horses in terms of their connection with people all over the world, not just in the steppes of Eurasia.
Well, great. I mean, I think now that we're kind of running short on time, maybe this is a good time to then just ask you, having now written uh this book that covers all of horse and human history, what's your next project? What are you working on now?
So I think any reader of Hoofbeats will certainly come away with the idea that there's so much more to learn, right? There are many questions that remain unanswered, whether they be from the initial domestication of the horse all the way up to the absolute last chapters of, or most recent chapters of the story, because I'm sure there's many more to be written in the future. But we're working on a few things I think have not quite gotten the attention, especially from an archaeological science perspective, that they deserve. So, uh, for example, I have a partnership with Dr. Aquino Gundiran at Northwestern University, who's really interested in exploring the role of horses in West Africa from a more, multidisciplinary archaeological science perspective. We have a project here that's going to start looking at the Pony Express. So we've done some preliminary inquiries and investigation here, and start to kind of apply the science to even the 1860s. Still, there's, I think, a lot we can learn from some of these other, biomolecular techniques and that sort of thing. And of course, for me, my true, you know, love, the place I'm, most deeply connected with is always going to be, I think, the Mongolian steppes. And so, we're continuing to do some really exciting work up there, in which what we're learning is that the earliest clues to the human horse story, Mongolia is a place where archaeological data sets can be hard to come by, especially ones that have good organic material. It's a, harsh environment. There's not a lot of things like floodplain deposition or classic archaeological sites. And so we've been doing this project where we're looking at high mountain snow and ice and finding, in fact, clues to the earliest horse, domestic horses emerging, melting out of, mountain glaciers and snow and ice patches. And so that's what we spent our summer doing, and it's some pretty exciting results, to hold the, mummified remains of the first horses in the eastern steppe. And so that's what we'll be working on going forward.
Well, it sounds like all very exciting lines of research, and hopefully there'll be many books out of them that we can talk about on the New Books Network in the future.
Yeah, whenever Hoofbeats Volume 2 comes out, we'll have more to
Exactly.
talk
Yeah.
about.
Well, great. Thank you so much for talking with me today. And just again, the book is Hoofbeats: How Horses Shaped Human History by William Taylor.
Thanks so much.